And our next speaker here will be Srđan Stojnić from the Institute of Lowland Forestry and Environment in Novi Sad in Serbia. And he will explain us a little bit how he is investigating leaf functional traits as bioindicators of urban environmental impact on trees, since ALPTREES is not only a project that looks into the forests, but also into non-native tree species in the urban areas. Srđan, may I ask you to share your slides with us? Perfect, we can see it already.
Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Srđan. We can see your screen.
Which one? The one with the presentation or with the...
It's in the presenter's mode, but yes, click it, then it's maybe...
Okay.
Yes, we see everything perfectly.
Perfect.
Srđan, please.
Yeah, so hello to everybody. My name is Srđan Stojnić and I'm employed at the Institute of Lowland Forestry and Environment from Novi Sad, Serbia. The idea for this presentation starts from the assumption that actually only health trees and non-stress trees could provide a full scope of ecosystem services. Therefore, I believe that it's really important to select the suitable tree species for growth in urban areas. And searching the literature, there's a lot of records where different leaf functional traits have been used, have been exploited in the evaluation of different tree species suitability for growth in urban areas. However, when I have started preparing the presentation, I actually realized that it's not possible to list all the functional traits and all the stress factors. Therefore, I put accent on the physiological response to drought stress, as the drought stress has been frequently recognized as the most important stress in the urban areas, which intensity has been projected to increase with forthcoming climate changes. Just briefly, urban trees are exposed to multiple stressors which are either less present or non-exist in forest ecosystems. And these stressors act simultaneously or sequentially. One example is, for example, soil compaction under the influence of human activity, reduced capacity of soils to absorb the water, further inducing a water deficit in trees, which could negatively affect the vitality of them and making the trees more vulnerable to pest and disease attack. It's interesting also to mention that in urban areas we have factors which which stimulate the growth, but also induce stress conditions. And such parameter is, of course, elevated CO2 concentration, which promote photosynthesis and leading to the greater biomass accumulation and above ground growth. However, on the other side, CO2 concentration also reduce transpiration rates, exposing, therefore reducing that sensitive loss of heat from the leaf area and exposing the plants to possible overheating. Also, stress that urban trees encounter depend on the position of trees. So trees growing in the parks and the urban woodlands are of course less affected by drought stress than trees occurring on the squares and the pits along the roads and so on. As I already said, the drought is I think the main driver responsible for tree decline in the urban areas. Drought could be theoretically distinguished to short-term and long-term drought, and this short-term drought is especially dangerous for the young seedlings, newly transplanted seedlings, which do not have develop the root system. A long-term drought could equally affect all the major trees, and it typically induced radial growth decline, and could also trigger the premature mortality if occurs cyclical. Here I listed some drought-resistant strategy that could be employed by plants. There's no actually clear border between different strategies, and it's possible that a single species use different strategies. For example, drought escape is sometimes considered.
In een planning hebben staan dat zij.
Okay. This strategy is sometimes considered as drought avoidance strategy, because with this strategy, plants are actually trying to be not exposed, how to say, to water deficit. I think drought escape is a typical, for example, for maybe wild cherry, the species that has a short life cycle, and reproduction finish before this because the environment becomes dry. Concerning drought avoidance, the main aim of this strategy, how to say, is to preserve high water potential inside the plants, and plants usually do it by minimizing water loss and optimizing water uptake. Concerning drought tolerance, this strategy allows plants to tolerate low tissue water content by different osmotic adjustments and so on. I wouldn't go into details. Having this in mind, selection of suitable tree species for growing in urban areas should not rely only on aesthetic values, but this complex interaction between plant physiological status and surrounding area has to be considered. And actually, this selection is aimed, should be oriented toward the mitigation of negative effects of climate change, as well as maximization of ecosystem services. Very important is keeping a high and promotion of high biodiversity, which could be promoted both at intra and interspecific levels, and introduction of non-native species alongside the use of drought-resistant autochthonous species could be one of the solutions how to enlarge the diversity inside the cities. Now, when we are talking about interspecific diversity, before we change the species or introduce the new one, I believe that we should firstly try with the different provenances of native species. What's the concept behind this approach? Provenances of tree species usually characterized with a different genetic architecture, which is developed as the consequence of long-term adaptation, evolutionary adaptation to specific conductions within a species distribution range. And there are already observed that certain provenances growing in the dry region are better adapted to drought conditions. When we are thinking about this assisted migration and using of provenances, it's important to say that provenances should be selected from the origins where the current climate conditions correspond to the climate conditions which will prevail in the target area in the future. I mentioned here also marginal population, because marginal populations are those which grow usually on the geographic limits of the species, and especially we may consider rare edge populations which grow on the low latitude limits, because these provenances are developed under the influence of different selective pressures in comparison to the provenances from the central area. Here I wanted just to show you the importance of genetic diversity. We had experiment last year where we exposed the seedlings of Quercus robur to combined drought and heat stress. And these are, of course, extreme cases. On the left, you may see two genotypes from the single populations which were exposed to this combined stress, I think for maybe 2 weeks, let's say. And you may see that one seedling is completely healthy, the second one suffered from chlorosis. On the right, we have the genotypes from different population, and you may see the results when the plants are exposed to what could happen if you expose the plants to different stress factor. When I was talked about marginal populations, a few years ago we published a study where we studied variation in xylem vulnerability to embolism in European beech, and for this purpose we used only marginal populations. You may see that we don't have populations from the central area, but only from southern Europe and from the northern. And actually what we have found, the provenances or populations growing in the southern Europe showed higher resistance to embolism than provenances from the northern Europe. You may see I marked the southern European populations with the green and North European with the red. The most resistant populations was those from the southern France and from Bosnia. Therefore, these provenances might be considered as target provenances for some future reforestation in Northern Europe or for using in the urban areas where temperatures are higher. Leaf traits has been recognized as the principal component by which for the acclimation of plants to site conditions, and depending on the tree species, there are a really huge range of strategies to withstand drought stress. They could include some physiological, biochemical responses or modulation in anatomy and morphology, which are more common in response to some long-term drought. Now, the plants usually use, concerning physiological response, they use two mechanisms, isohedric and anisohedric. Isohedric species possess the effective mechanism of stomatal regulation of transpiration. Later, I will show you some examples. And even if soil water potential decline, the species are able to reduce the water loss and to prevent loss by stomatal control by closing of stomata. And these species very often has developed root system, small leaves, and high leaf mass per unit leaf area. Concerning second group of species, these species they have limited capacity, how to say, to control to control the transpiration, and they could maintain high stomatal conductance even under conditions of water deficit. However, these species possess cavitation resistant vessels, and they could they have a better capacity for osmotic adjustments. For example, the isohedric species is, I don't know, Acer pseudoplatanus, and anisohedric is Fagus sylvatica, yes. So I would like to show you some examples where physiological parameters has been exploited for evaluation of tree species drought tolerance and therefore their suitability for growth in the urban areas. So this is one study conducted in Warsaw in Poland, and the author studies 8 tree species, their tolerance, which were planted along the road, but on the short and the larger distance from the road. And they use this, I would say, very simple but very useful parameters: maximum quantum yield of photosystem 2, and this is a very commonly used parameter for the evaluation of photosynthetic apparatus state or efficiency. For example, the authors propose this value 0.83 as optimal, and in the literature it could vary, but it is usually, as far as I know, about 0.8. And the study actually show that these 3 species, Gledicia, Platanus, Hispanica, and Pyrrhus calleriana, reach the values approximate to optimum regardless of their distance from the road or a date of measurements. Just to say one good thing, these measurements was done with a device called HandyP, and this device is actually really good for these, I would say, brief measurements, because it's possible to do to make a huge number of records in the short period of time. For example, later I will show you some research which we perform with some maybe, I can't say more sophisticated, but the equipment which allow more options. However, these are even more demanded. And here, this is another research, I would say really great research, where the authors actually studies what happened in seedlings if they are exposed to more stress periods. And they use the same parameter like in the previous case. And you may notice, I don't know here, actually the parameters start decline at the end of first stress period, and we may notice that the lowest values are actually observed when the recovery already started. And okay, the seedlings has been recovered, and then the second period start, and it's obvious that it was much more pronounced in different tree species. Very interesting is the response of tree species. For example, take a look. In the first drought period, Quercus robur showed to be very tolerant, but look what happened in the second. There's a sharp decline was observed, and until the second period of recovery, the species didn't return on the initial values. For example, what is this? This is Betula pendula, has a high reduction of this parameter, but it succeeded to return, while some other species like, yes, here, okay, Tilia cordata, Alnosutilis, even in the second period, they were successful to recover from the drought stress. Okay, this is the research that we have conducted, I think 2 years ago in the urban areas Novi Sad. We actually compared physiological performances of sweet gum and the Norway maple under drought stress, and why these parameters physiological are good. For example, if you take a look in this figure in the upper left corner, it's visual index and decorative value, which was completely equal. There was no any differences, but drought significantly reduced. These are gas exchange parameters, and interesting is that we take a look at the water use efficiency and in the water use efficiency and the intrinsic water use efficiency, it's obvious that it was higher in the sweet gum in the both dry and wet drought and wet period in comparison to Norway maple. On the right, we have these are light response curves. These are measurements of chlorophyll fluorescence, and there are several parameters, but in the literature you may found that this MPQ, it's a non-photochemical quenching, figure F. This is one of the fastest employed protective mechanisms of plants to cope with the stress factors. And based on this parameter, it's possible to follow the drought tolerance and the reaction of the species to, in our case, of drought stress. This is a similar research that we conducted in the same year. However, here we used two magnolia species, and we used the same gas exchange parameters. It's common gas exchange parameters measured with the portable devices, but we use a bit different, maybe some chlorophyll fluorescence parameters. And what we actually observed in the literature, it's stated that more tolerant are those species that that are able to downregulate the transpiration by adjusting the stomatal conductance. For example, here, if we take a look, this is E, it's transpiration, S is stomatal conductance. We may notice that Magnolia grandiflora greatly reduced both parameters to prevent excessive water loss. Also, it's possible to see that, like in the previous case, that Magnolia grandiflora had much greater values of water use efficiency. Concerning this chlorophyll fluorescence, here we may notice that this parameter, that light-induced non-photochemical fluorescence quenching and heat dissipation of light energy, these parameters appeared to be very useful indicators for the selection of drought-tolerant species, because it's you may notice that the two studied species showed completely opposite reaction when exposed to drought stress. The last one research here, we studied irrigated and non-irrigated trees of Quercus robur and Carpinus betulus. However, in this case, we did not use the chlorophyll fluorescence parameters, but certain gas exchange like stomatal conductance and net photosynthesis. We found observed the reduction of both parameters. The reduction of stomatal conductance was more obvious. And it's commonly described in the literature. Interestingly, the concentration of photosynthetic pigments was not statistically different between irrigated and non-irrigated seedlings. And here we have a biochemical some parameters which, for example, concentration, free proline, the antioxidant activity, and concentration of malonyl-D-aldehyde, which is final product of lipid peroxidation, greatly increased in response of plants to drought stress. Since I have, Katarina, may I continue with this approach, or should I finish the presentation?
Come to an end, please.
But I will take you five more minutes, probably.
One, please.
One, okay, then I will skip this part. It's about, I wanted to talk about geometric morphometric as some approach which could be suitable for the citizen science, because everybody could collect the data which are later processed by someone who's experienced. But okay, we may talk about it later. Concerning conclusion, here I listed some criteria for the three species that should be used. Of course, the species should be climate adapted, not only on the ongoing climatic condition, but also condition predicted by climate changes. Minimal disruption, they should not be invasive and do not pose a threat to human health. And of course, species should provide the ecosystem services in the maximum of their capacity. So for this reason, I think that some guidance on native and non-native species which are drought tolerant and has a potential for growth in urban areas should be prepared or created for specific regions. For example, for Alpine Space, I told Katarina already when I was preparing the presentation, I found actually several classification systems which was difficult to compare because these systems use, for example, different methodologies. They had different, they have a not different definition for drought tolerance, but different, how to say, maybe thresholds. It's also difficult to compare the three species of a different age growing in the different conditions, climatic conditions, and different parts of the city, and so on. So this tolerance classification should be made on functional traits, and very important thing that maybe it could be, some of the lists could be updated based on the new knowledge about physiological response of different tree species. Here, what I meant under this science against practice, maybe for the practice we really don't need such extensive studies like we conducted on Magnolia. Maybe it's not necessary to know all those physiological mechanisms behind the process of drought tolerance, but it's maybe better approach to use to make a really big number of measurements across different cities and so on, and to try to compare the data in such a manner. And there should be also created a list of plant traits that could be exploited as bioindicator of species tolerance to stresses. And here I just wanted to say this different classification system. For example, I found this database. It's I think it's developed by Dresden University, and here you may see that the Magnolia grandiflora is described as a drought sensitive, as sensitive tree species. However, you found that in our study we found that it could cope with drought stress. Thank you very much, and sorry for the long presentation.
Thank you very much. Don't be sorry. It was extremely interesting, and so many studies you have conducted. I will summarize some of the questions which have reached me. What from the conclusions you draw, what are the implementation possibilities for urban planners, for landscape designers? Do you know about some decision-making tools that could support transporting this knowledge gathered in a scientific environment into the practice?
Please continue. Okay, concerning this practical application, it should be, as I mentioned, based on this knowledge. Some lists should be prepared, but for a specific region, because it's not the same if we compare the performances under Mediterranean climate or, for example, in Germany. Based on these traits, however, it's hard to find, when you mentioned that we should maybe evaluate a huge number of tree species, it's hard to find enough papers which deal with all the tree species, and sometimes it's difficult because, for example, even if you measure the same parameters, for example, net photosynthesis or stomatal conductance, if you use two different devices, for example, in our institute we have I think that United Kingdom is producer of both Cirrus-3 and LCEP Pro, or for example, Lycor. They could give different results because they are using different methodology how they measure those gas exchange.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will have a chance to chat, or maybe you have a chance to answer the other questions in the chat. Thank you very much, Srđan, for your presentation.